So I want to start with that acknowledgement of being on First Nations land and asking for us all to do what we can to ensure that the powers that be honor the treaties that are in place. So Dennis, you were going to do something that would let me know I could start?
Yep, we're good to go, Janine.
Okay, well, thank you to all of those who are here in attendance. I just want to briefly go over the bios of our panelists. I'm so delighted they could be here. I want to welcome sincerely Laura Tyler, who's the Executive Director of Sustainable Building Manitoba, where she leads advocacy, education, and collaboration efforts to advance sustainability in the built environment. And as a dedicated community organizer, I've watched Laura go through many different incarnations as a community leader, and really feel that it's wonderful that she's in the position that she's earned right now. So she's worked on social justice issues related to hydro development, austerity policies, and food security. All of your work, I feel, really has supported the green values of health, ecology, fairness, and care, Laura. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'm equally delighted to have Scott Forbes here. Scott is an ecologist at the University of Winnipeg, where I studied for many years. And has been there since 1992. So quite the career, 33 years. Congratulations, Scott. That's a long time to be supporting sustainable ecology. He teaches that and other courses there. So has worked, to a great deal on fish and wildlife issues for more than 4 decades. So again, sincere appreciation for the work you've done and that you could be with us here this evening, Scott. And last but definitely not least, a man whose work has really made my life and my education efforts so much easier, Kurt Hull, Project Director of Manitoba Climate Change Connection since 2009. That's a long time to be plugging away, Kurt. I'm so glad you are a dedicated activist. So worked on many clean energy and sustainability projects, diesel and winter roads for First Nations. I wasn't aware that you'd done that work in northern Manitoba. You've worked with and advised engineer geoscientists in Manitoba on their climate change initiatives, and is lead author of Manitoba's Road to Resilience, Climate Solution Studies and Booklets here in Manitoba, to which I have referred many people when they've asked me, what should we do? We at the Green Party say, read Manitoba's Road to Resilience. That's what we need to do. So thank you, Kurt, also for your excellent work. And I'm sure if we were in person, everyone here would join me in applauding you. So I'll just do the online version of applause for all of your efforts. So who wanted to go first?
We've agreed that I'll go first, Janine.
Excellent.
So
Please
thanks
take it
very
away.
much. Thanks very much for that. So I'm going to share my screen here. And what I'm going to do with the limited time that I'm just going to give you an overview of some of the key ideas that are in the Road to Resilience series of documents that you mentioned. And buckle up, folks, because there's a lot of ideas coming here, but hopefully they'll be expounded upon by Laura and Scott. Some of them do those ideas, and then we'll have more of a discussion related to these topics. Okay, so let's start with actually, I started in 2007, Janine, with the Climate Change Connection, and this is my colleague Susan here. And so Susan and I have been working together for it's 18 years. And so that has been my home, and my work has been through my work with Climate Change Connection. But lately, in the last couple of years, Climate Change Connection has become part of the climate action team. So there's 5 environmental NGOs that have all gotten together and have been working together very collaboratively and very successfully. And one of the key outcomes of our work has been this Road to Resilience documents that you mentioned, Janine. So we published the first of those documents in 2001, and that document provided the framework, the key framework for the pathway to a climate resilient, fossil fuel free future for Manitoba. And I'm going to go through a few of the key ideas that are in that document here in the few minutes that I've got. So starting with what do we mean by resilience? It's the road to resilience. Okay, what do we mean by resilience? And in our definition, we say that it's the ability to meet our essential needs ourselves without fossil fuels. And what are our essential needs? And this is really where the key challenge that we're working on is put into words here. If we think about it, in order to address climate change, we need to be able to feed ourselves without fossil fuel-based fertilizer and without diesel for the machinery. We need to be able to move all goods and people without gasoline and diesel. And we need to be able to heat all of our buildings, old and new, without fossil gas. And we need to use our energy, and primarily our electrical energy, as efficiently and effectively as we can in order to meet primarily the transportation and building challenges. Food and agriculture is its own animal, and I'm going to just touch on that briefly. But the burning of fossil fuels is in the transportation and buildings area. Okay, so let's start briefly with the food and agriculture. So first of all, food and agriculture are related, but they're different. Food is what you put on the table. And food, we can grow more of our own food. This photo here is an example of a community getting together and producing more of their own foods. This is Sustainable South Osborne, and some of the good work that they're doing there with not only creating food that they can share, but also building community. So that's really important. More food production locally and by ourselves. Then there's also an effort to connect local producers more closely with us as consumers. I'm a consumer, I'm not a producer. Okay. So with farmers markets, for example, or with customer supported agriculture, CSAs. So those are sort of the key areas. And I'm sort of making a transition now from food into agriculture, and one of the points between them is the recycling of nutrients. Like, so you can recycle nutrients yourself if you've got your own garden, or any kind of access to composting. There's Compost Winnipeg, for example, that you can go to collection. Look, if you're in an apartment or something and you can't compost, you don't have your own garden. So there's that. But when it comes to agriculture, there's some key concepts that are coming forward related to some of these key concepts that are within this discipline of regenerative agriculture and organic farming. And the work in the Road to Resilience has lately we've come up with a Road to Resilience agriculture solutions document that we've just published early in 2024. Just less than a year ago. And I'm not going to go through the details, but it may be of interest to some people that are interested in agriculture, because the difference between food and agriculture is food's what you put on the table, whereas agriculture is a business. And so the primary sort of objective or the fundamental objective of agriculture is being able to make enough profit to be able to maintain your farm. If whatever solution it is that you come up with, if we're not able to meet that requirement, it's not going to fly. So this document that we've published wasn't written by me. It was written by a couple of agrologists who are also producers. And what they've done is they looked at this question that you see on your screen here. How can we produce the marketable cash crops in Manitoba without using fossil fuel-based fertilizer profitably? So what they did in the document is looked at business as usual farm in southwestern Manitoba as compared to an alternative cropping system. And we can go into the details of what the different strategies were, but here's the outcome. This is what's really encouraging about it, is that in the alternative system, it produced 57% less greenhouse gas, or 57% of the greenhouse gases, including or using diesel for the machinery. Okay. But 34% more profit for the producer, largely because of fewer input costs. So that's just a taste of what's in that document. We haven't been peddling it too hard because we're mostly Winnipeggers at the climate action team. And what we really want to do is partner or get a conversation going amongst producers and producer groups to move this forward for them to move it forward rather than us. It's disingenuous for us to move it forward. Okay. So, and that last talk, that last part of we have to be able to feed ourselves without fossil fuel-based fertilizer and without diesel for the machinery. There's a concept here of on-farm biodiesel production. And within the Road to Resilience document that we did initially, there was an estimate that from one of the producers in Western Manitoba who estimates, depending on your cropping system, between 5 and 10% of your crop, of a canola crop, would produce enough biodiesel for the machinery required to produce the crop. And if you think about it, that's not that much different than the traditional agriculture, where a percentage of your farm was dedicated to oats for your bullocks and draft animals. And this is an example at Red River College where they use the waste chip oil, and they produce biodiesel like in this little machine here. It's not much, bigger than an old stereo cabinet, if you remember stereo cabinets from the 70s, for making enough biodiesel for all the machinery on the campus. So the next document that we're going to talk about is the Energy Solutions document that was produced and released in 2022. And this is where the majority of my work is related to policy involved in making the suggestions in this document come true. And basically, what we're talking about when it comes to power and energy, we put numbers to it in this Road to Resilience Energy Solutions, where we said, if we're going to heat all of our buildings and fuel all our vehicles electrically, how much power and energy would be required? And the difference being power is instantaneous and energy is an integral over time. And Hydro's numbers that they produced in 2018 and then repeated just a few months ago was that if we were to sort of like magically change all the buildings and all the vehicles immediately, that we would require we would have to be able to deliver 200% more power at the peak, and we would require a doubling of the annual energy supply. So we looked at the numbers and said, okay, what do we need to do to make that happen? And what we came up with, because we opened up our minds and said, we can go anywhere we need to go, but we believe that the best approach is by demand reduction and energy storage are the primary. And I'm going to talk about some of the key ideas in this. Okay, so let's start with transportation, because we get a lot more of the two. Buildings is more challenging, and Laura's going to talk about that in more detail. Whereas with transportation, we've got some options. And here's an option here. We're doing it right now. And rather than us all traveling from wherever we are to all get together, as much as pleasant as that might be, it's, most of us have to burn fossil fuel to get there. So reducing the need for travel is the first solution. And also, the travel doesn't necessarily need to be by vehicle. And there's parameters that make active transportation a reasonable solution. Obviously, you can't travel with a sheet of plywood on your back, but you can, if you're going to a meeting, you could, if the infrastructure's there, you could get there with that method. And public transportation, more public transportation, and a public transportation network and system which adheres to primarily the frequency and span and routes that are simple and direct. They take you where you want to go. And if you've got those things in place, then the public transportation system becomes more of a utility rather than just something to get you to work and back. And so the transportation, Winnipeg Transit Master Plan, I'm very pleased with it. It's going to happen. They're going to be rolling it out in June of this year. And I encourage everybody to give it time to adjust to it, because I just imagine there's going to be a firestorm as soon as it's launched, because nobody likes change. Okay. But it's based on those principles: frequency and simpler routes and span. The frequency being a bus every 10 minutes on the frequent service corridors, and then other less frequent feeder routes. Okay. But when we talk about transportation and climate change, everybody goes directly to electrification. And of course, if we use those other methods to get around first, but whatever's left over has to be electric. And so electrification is the primary solution for vehicle transportation. And up until recently, there hasn't been a lot of available choices, but that's changing really rapidly. All of the major car manufacturers, vehicle manufacturers are putting forward lots of different types of vehicles, including there's the Rivian half-ton there, and there's the Ford Lightning. But here's an interesting thing that gives me hope that this is going to solve it itself. The cost of production of an internal combustion engine is going up based on the cost of living, inflation. But the cost of production of an equal range electric vehicle has been coming down exponentially, and that continues to this day. It's interesting that this chart was shared by the Climate Reality folks in 2017. And it predicted those two lines would cross in somewhere around 2023, 2024. And I believe that it could well have already happened, not in the showroom, but on the production floor. That the manufacturers, primarily because there's fewer components in an electric vehicle, and especially when you put all of the pollution controls. And as evidence of that supposition, I'll point to this vehicle here. This is the Seagull from BYD, which is a Chinese manufacturer. It's not available here, primarily largely because of tariffs and protection measures that are taken for the local industry. And as much as we want to keep jobs in Canada and here, that's true. But this shows you the potential that is there when it comes to the cost of manufacture of these vehicles. So that's just sort of a heads up on that. That's it for transportation. Now we're just going to talk about briefly about buildings, and Laura's going to expand on some of this. So the importance of the part of the solution for buildings is primarily this. The buildings themselves need to be as efficient as possible, and the electricity that we use for heating needs to be as efficient as possible. And I'm going to go into both of those topics very, very briefly. So we've got new buildings and we got old buildings. When it comes to new buildings, this building that you see here is the first certified passive house around near Gillam. And so it uses like a fraction of the inherent energy as compared to a code built house. But this was a sort of a one-off, and there are a few passive house buildings being built, but it's more important, and Laura's going to expand on this, the importance of building codes to change the recipe so that it becomes the norm. Highly efficient buildings become the norm. But the much bigger challenge is the existing buildings. And what are we going to do about those? So we need to, and to a certain extent, and we believe that we need to bring all buildings up to a minimum energy use intensity. And come up with some kind of and retrofit the ones that are not at that level. But there's this approach here. This is Donald Proven and the Sun Certified Builders Co-op, and their approach is excellent. You wind up with a terrifically comfortable, efficient home, but it's very costly, very intrusive on your property. So we have to come up with some alternative approaches, and I think Red River College Polytechnic can help us on that. This is an Enercan approach, which uses a panelized approach, where you have a factory that you take a scan of the building, go back to the factory, you build panels, you put them on. It's less intrusive or less involved at the site.
Are you ready for about a 3-minute wrap up, Kurt?
Yep.
Good,
yep, I could do that. So this is actually getting to the most important parts, which is making the use of electricity as efficient as possible. Air source heat pumps would work for an individual, but it won't work for the grid. If we're going to be able to meet that power demand in January, we need to use ground source heat pumps, and either horizontal systems or vertical systems. And primarily, this is in First Nations, they've been doing a lot of work on there, district systems, where you connect a bunch of buildings together and they share the heating and cooling loads. So that's the primary aspects of buildings. And then when it comes to the generation or use of electricity, we have to make some additional generation. We recommended commercial, and there's some figures for you as to what we think we need. But yet North Dakota already has almost as much as we need that's installed right now. So we also talk about solar. We don't talk about solar so much on its own rather than solar connected to storage. And you can store it in your vehicle, or you can store it in these wall-mounted domestic storage batteries. And then there's just the whole concept of storage. Thermal storage is a big thing. So there, I'm wrapping it up, Janine. Lots of ideas to think about.
Lots of ideas, and I'm sure folks know where to find you to get more and delve into more depth. I certainly want to follow up on your agriculture booklet. It missed me, so I need to read up on that. Thank you so much, Kurt. That's wonderful. And thank you to those people that are using the chat. If you have questions, are we going to hold questions for discussion afterwards? I think we'll hear from everybody. So make a note in the chat or write it down. And it looks like Laura's getting ready to go next. Go ahead, Laura.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm just going to share the old screensy. There we go. Can everybody see that okay?
Perfect.
Oh, wait. Sorry, I'm just going to try that again and do this one. All right. Welcome to my presentation on what is sustainable building. And as you can see, there's a few aspects to it. Kurt touched on a bunch of them. Energy efficiency is absolutely one of the cornerstones of sustainable building, but we can't not remember, or we can't forget about materials. We can't forget about the indoor air quality, water use, etc. So there's a lot of different aspects to sustainable building. I'm not going to touch on them all in great detail, but I want to make sure everybody's aware of them. Okay, so in short, sustainable building is about a building being healthy for you as the person in it, but also for the planet. So when it comes to materials, how do we know if a material is sustainable or not? So it's that we really want to think about its entire life cycle, not just like the moment that it's produced, not just the way that it's used, but also how it's disposed of. Because what that brings us to is something called embodied carbon. And so here you can see where we kind of break down the different moments where we get carbon. So like much as Kurt just highlighted the fact that transportation is where a lot of the GHG emissions come from. That's also true in buildings. It's not just the heating aspect of it. It's not just the construction. It's also the demolition as well. And so really thinking about that is really important. And I do think it's important to think about that there's also the operational carbon. So that's when we're really talking about the heating of the building. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Write your questions for the end. I'm happy to try and answer them. So, what is the cheapest form of energy? It is the energy you don't use. So, energy efficiency means that you use less energy to perform the same task. So just so that we're thinking about this all on the same page, I just want us all to take a moment to think about the difference between energy conservation and energy efficiency. So you can see here that it kind of highlights how if you install a high efficiency fridge, that's an example of energy efficiency, versus if you turn the fridge temperature down a little bit, that's an example of energy conservation. So when we're doing some of the things like making sure that we're ready and we have enough energy, both have to be taken into consideration, but when and how does matter. So just so we're thinking about things correctly or the same. So again, energy efficiency means to use less energy to perform the same task with the help of technology, whereas energy conservation or savings is about using less by adjusting your behaviors or habits. So putting on a sweater, energy conservation, turning the heat down, energy efficiency. Well, it could be energy conservation. I guess energy efficiency would more be like the way that the building is insulated. So let's talk a little bit about fuel switching, because we know that here in Manitoba, one of the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions when related to buildings is how we heat them. And so that's where we're using a lot of our natural gas here. And so there's a lot of talk about going to the air source heat pumps or the ground source, the district systems, all of those things. That's great. But that's step 2, at least, because step 1 has to be energy efficiency. Why? Well, you don't want to overcapacity your system. So for example, if you haven't done the energy efficiency that you need to for your building, then what that might mean is the fact that you'll put too many solar panels on your roof, or you'll have to drill too many holes for your district system. So you're wasting materials, you're wasting time, money, etc. So energy efficiency, that's the first step. Ooh. Right, so what does that mean? It means we have to make sure our building envelope is nice and tight and well insulated. So what is a building envelope? Well, think about what an envelope is. It's the thing that goes all around your letter. And so in this case, it's your roof, it's your walls, it's your foundation, it's your windows and doors. So all of those together bring you to the building envelope. So you guys all might be sitting there being like, why is she wearing goggles and a hat? Isn't she indoors right now? And yes, you are correct. I am indoors. But I'm wearing them because they're an example of how I, as a human being, increase my ability to keep myself warm. So I've put on my hat, I've put on my goggles, and if I had a scarf, I might tuck my goggles into here, because it's not just about the fact that you're wearing extra clothes or you've added the extra insulation. It's also about making sure it's all connected and there's no gaps. So, like when you're trying to sleep and you're all curled up in a ball and your sweater and your pajama pants aren't just quite, tops and the bottoms aren't quite matching and it gets so cold. I know that experience a little too well. So that's an example of like not a nice tight envelope of your pajamas. And so think about with the houses. So when you're sitting in a drafty house, you know how uncomfortable that is. And so it's not just about having really great windows. It's not just about having a lot of insulation. It's about making sure that you have what they call a tight envelope. And so you can kind of see, and this is just rough estimates, that different parts of the house have different amounts of energy that's lost that way. So what are the barriers to sustainable building here in Manitoba? Good question. So this here is a list of topics that came out of one of SBM's, Sustainable Building Manitoba's, gatherings where we put up the Mentimeter and we asked, hey, community, what is the challenges that we're facing? And you can see education, cost, knowledge, those are the big ones. Cost is always, as we talk more and more, becoming increasingly the big challenge. When I first started with SBM, we talked about cost very differently than we talk about it now. And this was all done before the great unknown of the tariffs. Dum, 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 dum. So I'm no expert on the tariffs, but this is what I know from what smarter people than me have been saying. And so pretty much, if we think about the cost of materials, they could go up with that 25% tariff. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on materials. So add that to consumer spending power potentially going down. Add that to uncertainties around labor. That could mean less housing starts. And what a housing start is how many like new builds are initiated. Because much as we do with GDP, we're only counting new entries to the market in a lot of these conversations, not always the resale, which, as Kurt highlighted, is a huge problem. But it's like new and old are two separate conversations to a certain extent, much as houses and commercial buildings are two separate conversations. So there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to this. Will existing housing get more expensive because of supply and demand if we're not building more houses? Are the existing houses going to become more expensive? What are going to be the impacts of lowering trade barriers between provinces, which is one of the big talking points we're seeing a lot? That could be beneficial, could be bad. We're not sure. And then certainly one of the things with the United States and Canada having such an integrated supply chain means that a lot of materials are crossing the border many times. And so will that decrease? And if so, will that have an impact on the embodied carbon, which, remember, that accounts for the transportation as well. So there's a lot of unknowns around this, but certainly we do know it is absolutely going to have an impact. Nobody's surprised to hear that. All right, so what are we going to do about this? Well, Sustainable Building Manitoba has a lot of ideas. And so this is a look at our policy placemat, which I just gave you a link to in the chat if you want to look in more detail. And so you can see we've focused on a few key areas, codes and standards. We focused on the transition off natural gas. We also talked about workforce ready. The people are going to build the buildings. It's pretty important to think about sustainable materials, green financing, and life cycle thinking. And then finally, making sure that the environments are healthy for all. So feel free to peruse that, but let's dig into a few of them. Building codes. It's boring, but it's important. As somebody smarter than me once said, the keys to changing the world are usually in the boringest of places. And building codes is one such boring place. And so a few years ago, the province of Manitoba adopted codes which are set at the federal level, adopted at the provincial level, and then enforced at the municipal level. And so in Manitoba, the codes for the first time ever had energy efficiency tiers to them. And so the commercial side has 4 tiers, the housing side or the residential side has 5 tiers. And that top tier is net zero ready, which we'll get to in a moment. And so the idea is that rather than shocking industry, we don't want to just make them net zero tomorrow. Let's ease them into it. Let's build the skills. Let's build the workforce. Let's build the knowledge. It's based off the system that was in British Columbia. So it's tried and tested. And it's very exciting that they have this in. What's not exciting is that Manitoba adopted tier 1 across the board, despite the fact that we're building at tier 2. In many cases, some would even argue that we're building most of our houses at tier 3. So that's very disappointing from the last government. This government is talking a lot about how to get this going better. So far, we haven't seen the outcomes of that talk, but we'll see how it's going. There's a lot of federal funding around code adoptions, so they could just be waiting to get that all sorted. So keep your fingers crossed, and certainly if there's ever an opportunity to do any advocacy, letting people know that this matters is so important, because as Kurt said, one of our biggest problems is existing houses. And the last thing we need to do is build new buildings that are adding to the problem. The problem is already big enough on its own. It doesn't need any more help. And so building codes are really important. Unfortunately, at this point in time, they only apply with regards to energy to new buildings. We do not have existing buildings retrofit codes around energy at this point in time, unless your building is really new. So a lot of people here in Manitoba, we have one of the oldest housing stocks in the country. So, it's a big problem. It's also good to really take codes into consideration, because the cheapest time to build energy efficient buildings is at that initial point of construction. So we really want to get those codes right for a multitude of reasons. So I just touched on net zero for a moment. So I just want to make sure we're all kind of understanding net zero a little bit. So the building codes are all about being net zero ready. So what that means is that you're using enough energy, like you've reduced your energy use so that you could bring in a different type of energy to offset all of the greenhouse gases. So you could either install solar panels. In the case of net zero carbon, they might be offsets instead. So zero carbon is the one that is really looking at no fossil fuels are burned on site, only uses clean electricity or low carbon fuels. So hopefully that makes sense to people. So right now, Manitoba Hydro is trying to do their integrated resource plan to net zero economy. So it's trying to keep all of these different factors from all sectors into consideration on how we're producing energy in this province. That's a whole other can of worms. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it because it's a lot to think about. But net zero is one of those common languages that I think getting on board with, because sometimes people are talking about net zero energy, and sometimes they're talking about net zero carbon. Sometimes they're talking about net zero ready, etc. So just really being listening hard to the words people are using is important. Another thing that really could help us do some of this change in the world. So there's the push and pull of markets, right? There's the regulation, building codes that we force on people, but then there's the market demanding certain things. And so how do we get the market to demand more energy efficiency in its buildings, more sustainability in its buildings, better materials, etc.? One of the ways could be mapping it out, putting energy labels on buildings. So that's one of the techniques. If you go to buy a house, you often will ask for the house's utility bills, but that doesn't tell you anything about how that building actually functions, because there could be nobody living in the house. They could heat the house to a really high or low temperature. You just don't know. And so making sure that we have a standard way that people are understanding how the biggest purchase of their life probably is working is really important. And that by creating that awareness, by creating that knowledge, that could be one of the ways that the market starts to pull and demand more energy efficiency and more sustainable building. We talked a lot about how cost is a huge thing. And so what are some of the solutions there? Well, we've got the newest utility in the province. So the US Crown Corporation in the province, is Efficiency Manitoba, and they're all about reducing our use of energy and water. And so they've got a lot of really great programs going on. Manitoba's Hydro still has some legacy involvement in some of the things, but unfortunately, the federal programs that existed, the greener homes, that has ended. And so we're in a waiting period to see what's going to happen at the federal level before there could be more money coming that way. But cost is the great unknown, or is the great barrier. There's also a lot of questions around when do we rebuild versus when do we renovate? Because when we think about the embodied carbon and not just the operational carbon, then suddenly that changes our thinking a little bit. So there's a lot of things to think about. Workforce, huge. There's a lot of questions amongst tradespeople about how to do this properly. There's a lot of, this is the way we've always done it mentalities amongst people. So making sure that workers are properly trained and understand the work that each other are doing is going to be one of the ways that we increase sustainable building in Manitoba. But you can't discount enforcement. This is me trying to show you a picture of a building inspector, because if nobody's checking on the work,
Right.
who
Well,
knows if
speaking of
it's going
enforcement,
well?
5-minute alert, Laura.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So yeah, enforcement's a huge thing. So working on that, making sure that workers are doing the right thing, because trust from consumers, that's going to be, if you don't trust the people doing the work, you're not going to get it done. One bad story travels really far. So what are the mechanisms of accountability? So what can you do with your home is a great question. So the first thing you always want to do is start with an energy assessment. So somebody will come to your house, do what's called a blower door test, look around, and tell you how your house is working. And then they'll map out what's going on and how you could improve it. And so you can see all these yellow lines are the reductions, and they give you a little bit of a pathway. What's the biggest bang for your buck, or where can you make the biggest difference? So on that note, I would say we're saving questions to the end. So forget about that slide. Back to here. Thank you guys so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.
Oh, that was wonderful, Laura, and great that you had the costume of better insulation. I know that my family is, many family members are into put on a sweater, put on several layers. Let's keep it down as low as we can. And we do have a question for you, but we'll leave it to the end. So thank you so much, and thank you for the links you shared. Again, thank you to the people who are active in the chat. So your questions will be addressed after we hear from Scott, who I hope is ready to share his, and I know it's a lot coming at you. Hopefully this is being recorded, so it will be on our Green Party of Manitoba YouTube channel. So you will be able to go back and see it if you want to be inspired further. Okay, Scott, please take it away.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. And I'm trying to think why I started working on this. Maybe it was because I'm curious why our federal government keeps doing dumb things like providing billions to fossil fuel companies to fund carbon capture, which serves primarily to increase fossil fuel production. And why did we build a pipeline to the West Coast to increase oil exports when we really want to reduce our use of fossil fuels? So the question that I'm framing this around, and this is a work in progress, is why is the energy transition so hard? And the answer to hopefully not spoil the plot here is that there's someone pushing back hard, and these are corporations which have deep pockets. So this is something, the more I dig into it, the more it frightens me. And what I'm looking at is how fossil fuel companies have really altered in many fundamental aspects, our democracy. And I'm going to look at three dimensions tonight. First is the infiltration of the education system, including K-12 schools and universities and colleges. Then the second, the role of lobbyists. And lobbyists work behind the scenes in nefarious ways. And I'm going to briefly glance at that and then finish up by looking at the PR campaigns that are being run by fossil fuel companies and the greenwashing which is taking place in those. So the infiltration of our education system is really diabolical. And I'm going to start with a brief glance at the K-12 schools and then take a short look at universities. But very recently, 8 days ago, this report was published. And the title is Polluting Education, the Influence of Fossil Fuels on Children's Education in Canada. And I got to tell you, until 8 days ago, I wasn't aware of this dimension of the problem. I was more familiar with what's going on at universities. And this is a report by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and for Our Kids. And it's really quite shocking when you take a look at what fossil fuel corporations are doing. And so we have fossil fuels in our schools. And who are the companies? Well, it's Cenovus and Suncor and Imperial Oil and Canadian Natural Resources, ConocoPhillips Canada, Enbridge, TC Energy, Fortis, a few others, but these are the big ones. And they go out of their way to provide branded education materials to schools. They develop partnerships with government to develop curricula and resources. They sponsor school activities. They fund third-party education providers. And they're not giving a balanced view of our energy resources. These are pro-fossil fuel propaganda, which are being spread to our kids. So they're getting our kids in the K-12 system. We've known for a long time that they've been getting universities too, but before I get to that, just mention a term which I just came across, petropedagogy. And this was a term coined by Emily Eaton and Nick Day to describe teaching practices and resources that work to center, legitimize, and entrench a set of beliefs that align with the interests of the fossil fuel industry actors. And it includes greenwashing, it includes bias balancing. So if people are more concerned about the environment, well, we have to be equally concerned about the fiscal health of our big fossil fuel companies. It promotes positive relationships with indigenous peoples as a bit of a shield against the activities of fossil fuel corporations. It emphasizes technological optimism, and front and center here is carbon capture is going to rescue us all. Well, short answer is it's not. And then we've known longer that fossil fuel corporations have infiltrated universities. And there was a recent global review of this, and the paper is listed on the bottom left corner there in the journal Climate Change. And it reviewed the influence of fossil fuel companies at universities. And you read the paper, and about half of it's about Alberta universities. And there are so many ways that fossil fuel companies infiltrate universities. So you take a look at fossil fuel personnel, the chairman of Enbridge or whatever. These people sit on university boards and just a few random examples. University of Alberta, that wouldn't surprise anybody to see fossil fuel executives on the board of the University of Alberta, the University of Calgary, University of Saskatchewan. We have academic personnel, a cross-pollination serving on the boards of companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. The fossil fuel corporations will sponsor academic research centers. British Petroleum has funded a big institute at Princeton. they endow academic posts. And so Enbridge has done this at both the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary. They have named buildings, the British Petroleum Institute at Cambridge. They sponsor scholarships. Shell Canada does that. They have career recruitment events, and they advise on course curricula and degree offerings in places like Oxford and Edinburgh and University College London. Some of the most prestigious universities on the planet are being influenced by fossil fuel corporations in what courses they should be offering. And as an academic, that really bothers me. The second place I want to go is the role of lobbyists. And lobbyists are extremely effective in influencing political decision making. And so here is just one headline, and there have been some really great bits of investigative journalism, a piece in the Narwhal, some in the Tyee, which have dug deep on some of these relationships. The the TC Energy executive took credit for manipulating David Abe's position on the role of liquid natural gas in British Columbia. He was a skeptic at first, but under the lobbying of TC Energy, he's now pro fossil fuels, and this is very disturbing. And the lobbyists, their tactic is to flood the zone. So it is an assault on public officials. And the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives published this a few years ago. They did an analysis of 7 years of lobbying of the federal government, and they recorded 11,452 contacts over a 7 year span, or 6 contacts per day. It was highly concentrated amongst the biggest fossil fuel firms, and they lobbied the federal government at rates which are 5 times higher than environmental non-governmental organizations like the Suzuki Foundation. They just don't have the deep pockets to pay for lobbyists that Encana and TC Energy and Enbridge do. And they did an analysis of the network of contacts. And so they were looking at the elected public officials. And so you can see a few names in this network analysis. Here's Catherine McKenna, the former Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And the red dots are the government officials. And then you see all of the contacts from all of the corporations: Husky Energy, Talisman, Fortis, Chevron, Sherritt, TransAlta, TransCanada, West Coast Energy. Just look at that image. This is the assault on our public officials by lobbyists for fossil fuel corporations. And fossil fuel corporations are the most active of the industry groups in Canada. And the corporations wouldn't pay for lobbyists if they weren't effective. And so, how are lobbyists effective? Well, we benefited from the leakage of confidential documents, which have revealed some of their tactics. And here's an analysis of some of the things that they've been doing. And so in 2023, this is an analysis of public information. The private stuff I'm going to get to in the next slide. They lobbyists' agenda is to protect fossil fuel interests by influencing government decisions. And so in 2023, year before last, the key areas were regulations for capping emissions from the fossil fuel sector, clean electricity regulations, methane regulations, and these are all policies which are aimed to curb emissions and phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And so the industry responded with intense lobbying to delay, weaken, or derail these initiatives, and they were successful, at least in part, in doing that. Now, the lobbyist tactics. This is from a leaked document. I'm not going to reveal the corporation. I might get in trouble. But this is actually a piece which appeared in the Narwhal if you want to look it up. And the lobbyist tactics, in some cases, are truly sinister. This is a document where a company lobbyist was instructing members of the company how you go about swaying government. And so, first step is you cultivate relationships with influential bureaucrats to gain political support within government. And the next one is the one which just stunned me. They encourage company staff to seek out opportunities to meet politicians in casual settings to advance company initiatives. And this means, in some cases, that the guy who was giving this spiel would hang out at Costco because he knew that a key government official, I think it was a deputy minister, would go there. And so he would spend hours waiting for this person to show up to accidentally bump into him, to strike up a conversation and hear the private and public overlap. And this is a way to influence people to bring them around to the side of the fossil fuel companies. They will seek out lower level public servants, the people who prepare the briefing notes for decision makers, the deputy ministers and ministers, and they will prepare briefing notes for these underpaid and overworked public servants to use for official government briefing notes. And this, if you're familiar with what happens in America and things like the Atlas Institute, that this is par for the course to write policy and then pass it off to legislators. They will place staff at public events to ask scripted questions. They will leverage relationships with public diplomats. So if there's a trade junket going to Japan, they will have fossil fuel lobbyists speaking to the Canadian ambassador in Japan and telling them what the ambassador should speak to the politicians about when they make their visit to the ambassador. So this is a backdoor way of getting their pro-fossil fuel message to prominent decision makers, and they will work through the media to suppress adverse stories. So these are part of the lobbyist tactics. And then there is a revolving door between government and the fossil fuel companies. And the table on the left, it wouldn't surprise you at all to learn that there are people in the conservative and liberal brain trusts which are derived from fossil fuel corporations. We like to think that the NDP is above that. Well, the table on the left is a document tracing all of the linkages between fossil fuel companies and senior NDP staff, including someone who was the president of the NDP for a couple of years, Brad Levine. He leaves the Alberta government and immediately heads to become a consultant with Tourmaline Oil. So that's disturbing. We see staffers under Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta. One of his staffers, Brock Harrison, leaves Kenney's office and moves in with TC Energy. The one which really knocked my socks off was this one. So John Horgan, a premier that I really admired in British Columbia, he leaves office and almost immediately takes a job on the board of a spin-off of the Teck Coal Company. So he joined Elk Valley Resources after being the premier, the NDP premier, British Columbia. So the lobbying feeds into the public relations campaigns, and really what is old is new again. And it won't surprise many of you, I imagine, to learn that exactly the same public relations firms which were working for big tobacco, and one of the biggest in the world is Hill and Knowlton, they're now being paid to work on the fossil fuel file. So they now work on energy and industrials. That's one of their big accounts. And some of you might be familiar with some of the early smoking propaganda. And if you're not familiar with it, look up the infamous Frank statement, which was the brainchild of Hill and Knowlton in 1954. And this was a Frank statement to cigarette smokers. And basically, it was uh, arguing that really there's no link between smoking and cancer, and don't believe these authorities. There's no agreement among the authorities. There's no proof that cigarette smoking is one of the causes. And so this is sort of stage one of what PR firms do. And there are really three stages to PR campaigns. And this was the three steps which were used by PR firms to defend big tobacco. First, the first step is you deny. There's no scientific evidence. Then once the scientific evidence starts to mount, then you transition to doubt. So this is the three Ds of a campaign. Doubt is the second one. You cast doubt on the science and say, well, there may be some evidence, but it's equivocal. And then finally, we're at this stage with fossil fuels and climate change. Is okay. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. It's now embarrassing to try and deny it. So now what we do is we turn to delay. So in the case of cigarette smoking, light cigarettes are so much better. Low tar cigarettes. In the case of fossil fuels, it's now you resort to greenwashing. So, carbon capture will save the day. They will spread information or misinformation about electric vehicles, saying, well, they're not really that reliable and they don't work in the winter. And then they'll promote things like natural gas as a transitional fuel. Well, it's better than coal. Well, actually, it's not. It's when you do the full carbon accounting, it's just as bad as coal. This is part of the greenwashing campaign.
5 minutes, Scott.
Okay, just wrapping up. So the biggest public relations effort is a consortium of the six largest oil sand producers, which are all headquartered in Alberta: Canadian Natural, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, Suncor, Imperial Oil, and Meg Energy. And so they've put together the Pathways Alliance, and you've probably seen press releases from the Pathways Alliance, and they will proudly declare that they're working on Canada's energy future, and you can learn more about carbon capture and storage if you go to their website. Well, the there I love it when I can find a scientific paper which details this. So this one showed up last year in Energy Research and Social Science. Greenwashing, net zero, and the oil sands in Canada. The case of Pathways Alliance. So you can read the paper, but some of the highlights are here. Um, the greenwashing topics, which are promoted by things like the Pathways Alliance, as well. We have the cleanest oil production in the world. No, we don't. We have the dirtiest oil in the world. It requires so much more processing than light sweet crude. It's heavy oil, the tar sands oil. It's not clean. And we use vast amounts of energy to extract it from the ground. So it's not the cleanest production in the world. They'll talk about the ethics of oil production. So we're so much better than the Saudis. The political systems don't extract oil. It's part of the oil company's job to do that. They will claim to work collaboratively with government while undermining government approaches and targets. And if you look at their releases of data, they will undercount current emissions from the oil sands. They make grossly exaggerated claims about the efficacy of carbon capture, which, the truth be told, there's no case where carbon capture has worked at the scale promised. And what they're using carbon capture for, and the Canadian public is subsidizing massively, is they're injecting carbon dioxide into the ground to increase oil and gas production. And that's the opposite of what we should be doing. We need to be reducing our use of fossil fuels. So just to wrap up with, you can't trust fossil fuel companies. Well, one of the greenest fossil fuel companies in the world was British Petroleum. And so this is an image from their 2020 campaign about how they're committed to low carbon electricity and integrated gas and bioenergy and hydrogen. We're going to use green hydrogen. And this is all good. We're fully on board with the green energy transition. Well, this is from the 24th of February, 2025. British Petroleum just ditched its green pledge and they're betting big on oil again. So all that stuff about renewable energy, we didn't really mean it. So this is one of the reasons you can't trust fossil fuel companies. And I've noticed that Catherine McKenna, who was our former Minister of Climate Change, has been making this point on social media, and she's said some very unkind things about the fossil fuel industry. So this is all a little bit depressing. And the question I'll just leave you with, and I don't have an answer to this, and I'm hoping to find some help with what do we do about the fossil fuel influence, which is so pervasive in our democracy. And the best that I could come up with in short notice is we just have to make people aware of what's going on and then work on next steps after that. So that's all I've got to say. I thank you for your attention and I'll wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Scott. We've got some interesting questions in the chat. Um, James, I'll get to yours in a minute. There was one beforehand from Debbie and the Gang of Fur. I think this one is for you, Laura. How do recycling efforts such as Habitat for Humanity factor in to more sustainable building?
Well, when it comes to talking about Habitat for Humanity, we have to shout them out and recognize that they are building some of the most energy efficient build housing in the province. And that is really important because we should never call housing affordable if it's not energy efficient. And so Habitat for Humanity is an incredible case study. They did the work, they crunched the numbers, and this is the outcome they've come to. And so when we're talking about sustainable building, they're a great example. And so, yeah, absolutely. Anybody who's recycling is doing some good work. But let's remember, it's reduce, reuse, recycle. And so reducing and reusing are the two things we're supposed to be doing first. So it's not always easy to reuse building materials, building components, but it's absolutely something we should be thinking about. If we're not thinking about that end cycle, that disposal part, excuse me, then we're missing a huge part of everything. So I hope that answers your question. I fear it might not have, but
Debbie, was there anything further you wanted to add on that? But thank you, Laura. I'm really glad to know that Habitat for Humanity is including that kind of efficiency.
No, that was a great answer, and I just want to say how much the fossil fuel industry and animal agriculture are running parallel in everything that Scott said. It was just like, wow.
You could have
flipped it either way.
The comments on agriculture in the classroom, when the Organic Food Council chapter of Canadian Organic Growers applied to be a member of ag in the classroom, they said, sure, no problem. You just have to give us $5,000 a year. And I was like hoping that they would cover my gas to attend meetings. So the influence of the agriculture, the chemical lobby in agriculture is the same as the influence that Scott just outlined so clearly. And for that, Scott, I wanted to give you a bit of a break because there's a very interesting question from James Bedham here in the chat for you. And other panelists too, but first directed for a response from you, Scott. Do you think the nuclear energy industry is using the same sinister lobbying tactics to portray nuclear as an answer to GHG reductions?
Well, they certainly do that.
SMRs, etc.
Yeah, they do that. They just don't have the same deep pockets as fossil fuel companies, which are I got out the statistics on how much money they make. It's like
mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing amounts, and the nuclear industry doesn't have the same resources. It's actually something I've noticed that you get two panelists, one defending wind energy and one defending solar, and the wind people will run down the solar people. There's competition among all the energy groups. To speak about nuclear. And I'm not really that concerned about the safety issues. Nuclear is just too damned expensive and it takes too long to build. And we have, the cheapest energy on the planet now is solar and wind, and we can build it out like it's going out of style. And it takes a decade at least to build a nuclear plant, unless you live in China and you don't worry about um, uh, state regulations.
Yeah.
Nuclear could play a role, but we have better solutions which are more immediate, which we should be focusing on. And nuclear is clean, but it's slow and expensive. So there's that.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to the question about nuclear energy using the same tactics? Okay, that's fine. We've got another great question from Dennis Lenevue. Nice to see you, Dennis. Thanks for joining us this evening. What about the proposal that Central Gas transition to providing geothermal water rather than natural gas, with the building owner only required to provide the heat pumps? Anyone like to comment on that?
You bet.
Central Gas.
You bet. This is my jam, Dennis. This is exactly what the Road to Resilience Energy Solutions has come up with as being a key part of the solution, which is in order to make the use of electricity for heat as efficient as possible. I mentioned ground source heat pumps, and I'll get a little technical here, but remember I said that we were going to have to provide 200% more power than we are capable of now. Well, that's based on a coefficient of performance of 1, as near as we can tell, in their estimates, basically baseboard heating. If all of our buildings were electrically heated with baseboard heating, we have a coefficient of performance of 1. You put 1 kilowatt of electricity into it, you get 1 kilowatt of heat out of it. What we need is a coefficient of performance of 3, 1 kilowatt of electricity in, 3 kilowatts of heat out of it. Okay, so we can achieve that with ground source heat pumps, especially if it's in a district system. And we proposed some time ago, and luckily it's received a warm reception in some quarters, is you now have a public utility with Central Gas that should be on the decline and should be looking at sundowning its operations, and the workers and the union coming to a dead end. With this idea of them transitioning into a utility, a geothermal utility, they can take a lot of the skills of laying pipe in the ground and servicing those kinds of fluid distribution systems and apply it to a growth industry, right? And a longer term sustainable industry. So I'm totally in favor of it, put it that way. And I think it's an essential part of the solution.
Yeah, and just building on some of what Kurt said, back in a lot of my pipeline fighting days, we talked to a lot of the unions around energy, and the Hydro's pipe layer union was really interested in the just transition and how to make sure that there's different work for their workers. And so the people who are thinking ahead, there's a lot of great opportunities in great transition. But as Scott just highlighted, there's some dinosaurs that sure are holding on.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I know. That's one thing, though. The dinosaurs are dying, but before they're dying, they're doing as much damage as they can. So Dennis adds, with nuclear energy so much more expensive than renewable energy, why is Ontario investing huge resources to building new nuclear plants? Anyone have any ideas on that? I would say somebody's been bought, but I may be a little jaded.
I would suggest it's more ideological than anything. That the first thing Doug Ford did when he got into office was cancel all the contracts for renewable energy. It's a basically political branding. If you're on the right, you have to oppose renewable energy, and they need a lot of energy, and nuclear can provide a lot. And I'm looking at the comments, and the comments about storage are exactly right. There are no good storage options. I don't even go to the storage and the possibility of accidents. I just stop and it being so damned expensive. It's so much more expensive than the alternatives. We should just be using off-the-shelf solutions. We have all the technology today to solve all these problems. We don't have to wait until tomorrow. It's here right now. We have the solutions. We just have to implement them. And nuclear, there might be situations where nuclear is useful, um, but as a big part of the solution, no, it's going to be wind, solar, geothermal, biomass. That's where the action is, and that's where all the growth is in energy production across the world now. It's renewables are outstripping fossil fuel growth, which is a good thing. We need to stop the growth of fossil fuels, but we have cheap alternatives. We don't need nuclear for most solutions.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to add briefly, Laura, before I address your question to the panelists, that I was once conducting wild rice inspections in First Nations area in Ontario, where there was a lot of the Canadian Shield. And after the inspection, he said, "May I take you for coffee and ask you some questions? I'm being lobbied." He was the business development operator for the First Nations. "I'm being lobbied to store nuclear waste from the Pickering nuclear plant. They want to drill into our Canadian Shield here and save it." And I said, "So who are the people are any of your people benefiting from any of this power?" He said, no, they just want us to store it here. And I said, well, my first reaction is the people who are benefiting from the power should make some kind of sculpture in the middle of their community and put the nuclear waste right there where they live. And it will be well maintained there because it's where the people live. Whereas if they store it in your First Nations underpopulated, very remote area, they don't care if there's fractures in the carbonate layer that may have it pollute your water or where it may migrate to. So they kind of like that response. And that's what I'm thinking. The people that benefit should be responsible for the waste. Now, moving from that on, we do have Laura asking some questions on why the pushback for renewable, against renewable energy is simply because not as much money to be gained. Anyone would like to respond to that? I think yes, Laura, that's the answer. There's not there that it would cut into their current revenue streams.
And another aspect is that if you think about it, that with fossil energy, it's a treadmill that you always have to be, pumping it out and distributing it, and then you burn it. It's a linear sort of process. Whereas with renewable energy, like I get a lot of questions about the where a lot of these materials come from, and sort of like, and the social cost of a lot of the materials to do with solar panels or lithium batteries and things like that. And I'm very conscious of that. But here's a bright light at the end of that tunnel, which is that there is a transition that we have to go through here to change from that linear fossil fuel treadmill to, once the primary aspect of that transition is over, and now we're working on with batteries and solar and wind and things like that, we're no longer on a treadmill. You've actually, like the batteries, lithium batteries can be infinitely recycled, like with minimal amount of additional material required. And that was a fundamental difference. And so the industries that are used to just feeding the treadmill, they're not going to have a continuous revenue stream. It'll be part of this transition, and then they got to think of something else to do.
Yes, thank you. And that echoes what Arlene just submitted. Wind and solar are essentially free once the infrastructure is established, because there can be a lot of recycling taking place there. So Dennis, do you want to speak to your question?
Sorry, just before you move on, I just want to highlight that the economic system that we live in, capitalism, is rewarded for growth. And so if you're not figuring out how to create growth, that's like a flaw, like that's going to be a problem in terms of how companies function. They get rated lower. And so, a company is not allowed to do something that is not in their shareholders' best interest. So there are structural issues in terms of our economic model. I'm wearing my MBA hat right now, that are absolutely pushing this. So it goes a little bit beyond just that piece of the money and the fact that it isn't generating more. It actually has bigger repercussions than that. Does that make sense?
I'll just jump in here, and I think one of the big overarching issues is in North America, we've seen a political tribalism develop, and it's basically the position of those on the right that renewables are for, granola bar eaters, and it's just something we don't want to associate with. And so I find it really interesting that the state which produces the most renewable energy in America is not California, it's Texas. And they're producing solar, and it's incredibly profitable. And why are they doing it? Not to save the planet. They could care less about the planet. It's incredibly profitable. So they're setting up battery facilities and solar production, and so they're leading the nation. And so this is the thing. What's going to win the day is economics. Renewables just make more economic sense, and the fact we're saving the planet at the same time is
Secondary.
that's gravy. So
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
just to build a moment off of what Scott said, we pay a lot of attention to what governments are doing. But if you look over at the stock market, there is a lot of talk about exactly this, the money and stop investing in fossil fuels. So it's pretty much like a lot in terms of the portfolios of a lot of different traders and like what people are encouraged to invest in and like what the top rich people are telling us to do. They're saying no fossil fuels. So there is like, it's very much one segment of the market that is doing this. And there's a lot of like some of the most innovation is coming from other players in the market, if that makes sense. So governments are a little bit behind for all of the reasons that Scott outlined, but there are some really incredible innovations coming from other places. So if you're having a bad day, there's like corporate knights are doing some really good assessment of what is going on in the market in terms of some of these issues. And yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Scott. Just before we move on and address Chris's question, and there's another one I haven't looked at yet. Dennis, I was asking you if you'd like to present your question. Thanks for your statement about it being a great panel tonight.
Sure, thanks, Janine. Indeed, yeah, thanks so much to the panel. This has been a fantastic session. I'm always one to recommend books, and I think a couple of you have already done so, but two in particular are Jeff Dembicki's The Petroleum Papers. He presents a fascinating history of why things are the way they are. So I'll just leave it at that. Look it up in the public library where it's available. And then the other is Seth Klein's A Good War. And just to kind of look at the notes that I made here, he makes a really strong case that we're in a climate emergency, and that's a term that we've formally adopted here in the Green Party of Manitoba. My question, I guess, to the panel is, should we adopt this recommendation that we look at this as an emergency similar to the way Canada mobilized during World War II? So anyone on the panel want to tackle that?
I love that book, by the way, and I agree with that, but let's hear from the panelists. Scott, let's hear your voice for a bit.
One of the things that I teach about when I talk about sustainable ecology is the use of alarmist tactics by early eco warriors. And we go back to the population bomb and Paul Ehrlich. And that was the population bomb. If you're not familiar with it, was Paul Ehrlich was forecasting doom in a book, which I think was written in 67, 68. And he was forecasting that India would collapse from starvation. And he made all of these prophecies of ecological doom, and none of them came true. The Green Revolution basically saved the world. And that's been used by opponents of ecological alarmism, saying, that you're always saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And so um, I try to use extreme terms carefully. And I agree, and I think we all agree that it's a climate emergency, but is that the best way to sell our message? Um, and I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that. It's it will appeal to some and it will turn off others. And I think it's the opponents we have to try and reach, the people on the right side of the political spectrum. And I'd like to find out how they would respond to the term. I think you might get people just tuning out with the use of that term, and um, we might have to find a cleverer, more devious approach if we're going to be successful trying to change hearts and minds. So I don't know. I'm sitting on the fence on that one.
Thank you, Scott. That's an honest and understandable response. Other panelists?
Yeah, Kurt hasn't unmuted yet, so I'm going to jump in, which is they have climate plans. They have plans. All of the governments do, all levels. Are they following them? So I don't think that implementing a climate emergency would necessarily be the mechanism to make them start acting. It's certainly an interesting program or project, but if they already have all these plans that they've voted in and they're still not doing them, I would question whether or not that would move them. That said, I think that climate action is a bit of a dead horse. I hate to say it. And so there's a part of me that me personally, I'm starting to think about emergency preparedness a lot more. And so part of emergency preparedness is emergency prevention. And so I'm wondering if that's a shift in language that is helpful in the world. And this at this point, this is just early thinking from me, and I'm only sharing it because of the question. But I do think that a lot of people say climate action and that turns them off. So what can we say that will engage people? And I do wonder if emergency preparedness is part of it. Does that mean we have to declare climate emergency? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think that there's better ways to use our precious advocacy efforts to get actual specific actions being taken. Because again, if they're not already following their own plans that they've voted in, what are we going to do? But just so that everyone knows, both the province of Manitoba and the city of Winnipeg, I know a bunch of you aren't in Winnipeg, but they're both trying to update their climate plans, but they do have other plans or strategies. So the province of Manitoba has the affordable energy strategy that they just put out. There's some good stuff in there. There's some gaps, of course. And then also the city of Winnipeg has the community energy investment roadmap. And because energy and GHG emissions are so closely connected, you can't really think about an energy plan without thinking about it being a climate plan as well. And you shouldn't. Some people are, but hopefully that helps some of your thinking.
Thank you. Kurt, would you like to respond? And this is also sort of helping us summarize, because Chris was asking if we could summarize really what should we do? And Laura just pointed some things out, and maybe you could address that too in your response, Kurt.
Well, with regards to Chris's question, well, first of all, I appreciate, Scott, what you're talking about, the terminology of alarmism and climate emergency. And the road to resilience, actually in our coordination and finance booklet, where we have policy suggestions. There's 13 policy suggestions related to coordination and finance. We do talk about the creation of I think at that time when we published it, we called it a climate emergency secretariat, but we've since changed it to climate action secretariat for the very reason that Scott was talking about, is that climate emergency, the federal government declared a climate emergency and then the next day bought a pipeline. So it's meaningless without action. And so when it comes to action, like Laura mentioned, the most recent energy plan from the provincial government, and if it's put into action, it's got a lot of good stuff in there. And the city of Winnipeg has the community energy investment roadmap, which has been ignored since it was adopted by council. But yet it's as fulsome and beyond as what the road to resilience, and the two agree very, very closely. So there's that. And just to answer Chris's question, I've asked many times in the media and whatnot when they say, like, what can we do as individuals? And I go, well, first of all, don't take this on. You can't solve the problem yourself. This is a systemic problem. It requires a systemic solution. It won't, but now do as much as you can to reduce the amount of fossil fuels you burn. Do as much as you can to use alternative modes of transportation. Do what you can to heat your home efficiently and things like that. But also identify where the barriers are that keeps you from going as far as you'd really like to go. And once you've sort of made a notepad for yourself and made a list of those things, then elect people who policymakers and that are going to take the action that's needed to remove those barriers. And then whoever, even if you didn't vote for them, whoever's in office, push them to take the action that's needed to remove the barriers. And like that is more, it's, you know, like I say, that's ultimately what needs to be done is a system change, not the change. You know, like a lot of people go, I got to do as much as I can. Well, you do have to do as much as you can, but realize that there's limitations as to what you're able to do just because the system's wrong. We're talking about a lot of systemic problems in this conversation.
Yes, excellent. Laura contributes system healing. And so working with the systems that we have our impact in. And I also want to say that in my life, because almost all of my money comes from organic growers, organic farmers, I feel I have a responsibility to be very careful about where I spend that money. And I try to keep it circling in the alternatives to the current industrial agriculture system. And so I'm very careful about what I buy and where I spend that money. So we do have economic power, and I think that's important. And so Chris is sharing the petroleum papers, terminology, emergency preparedness, which includes prevention and energy plans, Winnipeg's community energy investment roadmap, get councillors to implement it. Wouldn't that be nice? Make a list of barriers and push whoever's in office to change the system. Yes, Kurt is agreeing with that. And we're very close to the end of our time together, but I'd like to ask if there's anyone whose voice we haven't heard this evening, would like to share anything or any final comments? Because I agree, this has been an excellent discussion, and it will be available if you know someone who couldn't make it this evening, but would feel inspired by what's been shared by our three panelists, because there have been excellent links they've recommended. Please do direct them to our Green Party of Manitoba YouTube page. And on that note, I'd also ask that people consider joining us. I wouldn't be an effective leader if I wasn't encouraging membership wherever possible, because we do have policies that support what has been presented this evening. And a big part of my life is meeting with government ministers, writing to them, letting them know what our policies are and what we think should be done. And then I just have to join Debbie and the gang of Fur and Dennis in thanking very much our panelists this evening. I also thank Dennis for all the work he did putting this together, but big thank yous to you, Kurt, to you, Laura, and to Scott, and for everyone for attending. This is the kind of encouragement of one another that leads to more systemic change. So thank you all so much. Please continue to take very good care of yourselves. We need you in the positions you're in. We need you folks who attended here tonight. At one point, we had 24 people on the call, which is wonderful. And we're getting more and more messages coming in, thanking everybody. The community is important. It's a cornerstone. And lots of thank yous from folks. So do stay tuned in. Dennis is reminding us Wednesday, March 26th is our next event. So thank you all for your participation this evening, and hope to see you at our next one. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.